Okay, good morning, everyone, and I hope that you're all set for our webinar this morning. So, good morning to all our viewers who are joining again the PAASE webinars. So, for today, we have a distinguished lecture. So, I'd like to call the current president of PAASE, Professor Gisela Concepcion, to please introduce our speaker.
Good morning, dear colleagues and friends from the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering and from the National Academy of Science and Technology. Thank you for joining us today to witness a very special talk by a stellar and distinguished scientist, Dr. Cherry Murray of the University of Arizona, Professor of Physics, Deputy Director for Research at Biosphere 2, Benjamin Pierce Professor of Technology and Public Policy at the John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and Professor Emerita of Physics at Harvard University and co-chair of Inter-Academy Partnership. So I really cannot, well, make this very, very short to do justice to the exemplary academic and scientific life that Dr. Murray has lived. Dr. Cherry Murray obtained both a PhD and a Bachelor's of Science in Physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her research interests have varied from experimental condensed matter and surface physics to nanotechnology, innovation, research and development of telecommunications networks, national security and science, and technology policy. Her current interests include policy, research, development, and innovation to sustain human civilization and future Earth and beyond. In April 2019, she was elected to be one of 6 co-chairs of the Inter-Academy Partnership, or IAP, a collaboration of over 145 academies of science, engineering, and medicine. The IAP mission is to strengthen the independent voice of science at global, regional, and national levels by convening and empowering the world's academies of science and engineering and medicine to work together on issues of global importance. A member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Murray has received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, as well as the American Physical Society Maria Goeppert Mayer Award and George E. Pate Prize. She currently serves as chair of Board of Governors of the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology Graduate University, is on the Council of the Science and Technology for Society Forum in Japan, and as a board member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is the Universitas exemplar, scientist in every sense of the word, in the depths and breadths and heights of academics and scholarship. We have Dr. Murray speak to us today to share his wisdom, her wisdom and knowledge. So, Dr. Murray.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. I was just speaking earlier with a few of you that I've never been to the Philippines, but I have been living quite a bit during my lifetime in Asia, mostly because my father was a diplomat and he spent many years in various parts of Asia. So I had a wonderful time in Jakarta. We traveled throughout Malaysia. So I've certainly been in the region of the Philippines. So let me share my screen and start my talk. Very good. So I have recently moved to Arizona from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and have become Deputy Director for Research at Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2, as you might remember, in the 1990s was built to be an analog mission to people living off world, and it is now. Discovered the research there discovered quite a few things about how we could sustain the civilization off world or not, mostly or not. And we are still working on how do we actually do that in Biosphere 1, which is the Earth. And so I became very, very interested in this and am now managing the research programs, which are ecological research at Biosphere 2. But last year I was also elected one of the 6 co-chairs for the Inter-Academy Partnership. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about that, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, now I need to be able to, great. So the outline of my talk, I will talk first about just a very quick introduction to the Inter-Academy Partnership, then talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the way I like to think about them. Where we are currently heading with these Agenda 2030 in 2019, and what has been the effect of COVID-19 on this in 2020, and then talk a little bit about a possible silver lining. So first off, why is international science cooperation essential? Science is global. If you look at this plot, which shows you the years from 1996 to the present of the scientific publications of various countries, starting from the bottom, the US, then the EU, then China, then India, then Japan, and then the rest of the world, you can see that the number of publications from all of the world is really large, and they're totally global. And in fact, the best publications, the top 1%, have the most global collaborations. It is true that our human development is, let's just say 90% caused by science, technology, and innovation. Certainly there have been reports of, on the US economy, at least 75% is due to science and technology, possibly more now in the digital age. And there are critical policy issues that must be informed by science, and these are global. For example, on the left-hand side at the bottom is science needed for policy, climate change mitigation and adaptation, COVID-19 and future pandemics, biodiversity loss, deforestation, and I would say ocean pollution, and then AI, robotics, and what on earth are we going to be like in the future? There's also policy for science where scientists need to be involved, such as ethics, for example, genetic engineering of humans, open science, inclusive science, biosecurity and synthetic biology, and how to deal with scientific refugees. Today, more decisions that policymakers and governments need to make require science understanding and advice. And we are, of course, inundated with ever-present fake news, deep fakes, pseudoscience in the social media. And I will point out that the social media are a result of science, technology, and innovation. We have a resurgence of nationalism and populism on every continent, not just in the US, not just in the Philippines. And this really hampers global cooperation, harmony, and sustainable development. So it's critically important that scientists around the world work together. And I have been very pleased to see the amount of global cooperation in COVID-19 research and development in the scientific community, despite political pressures otherwise. The Inter-Academy Partnership has 140 national academies in sciences, medicine, and engineering. The Global Young Academy, which links to national young academies worldwide, and 4 regional networks, which are on the slide here, and over 30,000 of the world's most respected scientific, medical, and engineering leaders in over 100 countries. The reason I wrote EU and AU on the slide was to remind me to say that 2 of the academy networks, ESAC for the European academies, not just the EU, actually is the official advisory body to the EU for science. And NASAC, the National Academies of Science in Africa, is the official advisory body for the African Union. I also wanted to point out that the National Academy of Science and Technology in the Philippines is one of the 20 most active academies in the Inter-Academy Partnership. When the partnership started out, there were 8 academies in Africa, just starting. And this was in the 1990s. There are now 27. The vision of the Inter-Academy Partnership is for the world's academies to play a vital role in ensuring that science serves society inclusively and equitably and underpins global sustainable development. And its mission is to convene and empower the world's academies of science, engineering, and medicine to work collaboratively to address issues of global, regional, and national importance. The strategic objectives, which were adopted in the General Assembly in South Korea in 2019, was to build the capacity of and empower regional networks of academies and their national members. So for example, helping new academies to get established and helping them to provide scientific advice to their governments, and regionally and globally provide advice to the UN, for example, and to provide this advice, which is independent and authoritative, and to communicate the importance of science, engineering, and medicine for education, literacy, public discourse, and outreach. So for example, in capacity building, the academies got together in this project to inform global policymaking with focus on the sustainable development goals. There was a guide to the SDGs showing a guide to the very complex United Nations system and what academies could do there was also a very similar project for the African academies. A major study, which was a consensus report, very similar to what the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine at the US does, but far more global to regional to local in nature, was the Food and Nutrition Security and Agriculture Project, which is a 3-year project funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in Germany. And it studied the issues which are severe in food security throughout the world. A very influential project. And then there's a Global Science Education Council developing a program, and several programs actually, but one program funded by the Smithsonian Science Education Center and the Gordon Moore Foundation of the US, provides inquiry-based science education modules. The Inter-Academy Partnership, or IAP, is the reviewer for these and provides translations worldwide for pilots of these projects that are inquiry-based and community-based science. Really very, very impressive. There's one on the right labeled food that works off the food and nutrition study and the SDGs lined behind it. And this year they produced a science-based inquiry module on coronavirus. Now, the UN 2030 agenda was adopted in September 2015 by the member states of the UN, 193 of them. And this is actually amazing. The Sustainable Development Goals built on the Millennium Development Goals. However, the Millennium Development Goals were for developing countries, and these are for everyone. And they are inclusive, not just focused on avoiding hunger and global development, but global development with equity, quality education, jobs for people, clean energy, responsible consumption, climate action, biodiversity, maintenance, strong institutions, and partnership, including reduced inequalities. And these are incredibly important as they are completely comprehensive. And in fact, they encompass all that is needed in order to sustain future human civilization, as well as the ecosphere. Since they are so comprehensive, they actually interact with each other. And this is a diagram which just goes to show that in 2019, the Global Sustainable Development Report, which looked at how we are doing in 2019, looked at both the blue and the orange interactions, blue being positive feedback, orange being negative feedback from the goals influencing other goals. So the influencing goals are on the vertical axis. So you can see there's quite a bit of interaction among them, not surprising, as human civilization and the ecosystem of the earth are both very large systems and they interact with each other. I like to think of, and I recommend this report by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, called the World in 2050 report. They do one, first one was in 2018, and this is from that report. This is looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as a series of parallel transformations that human civilization and the earth is going through. Instead of thinking of a single transformation, all six of these are we are going through all of them at the same time. The Agenda 2030 is attempting to harmonize these transformations for the good of, let's just say, prosperity for all, social inclusion, sustainability of the biosphere, and resilience to future shocks. So we are all undergoing a human demographic transition, a digital revolution, which I would also like to broaden a bit to say the fourth industrial revolution, definitely an energy transition. And when I served as director of the Office of Science at the US Department of Energy for 2 years, at 2015, 2017, and we were mapping out this energy transition. Smart cities, cities becoming more sustainable, avoiding pollution, dealing with removing terrible housing such as slums and people who do not have housing, and dealing with migrants. We are attempting to reverse biodiversity loss, or at least mitigate it, do something about sustainable farming and fishing, and helping the biosphere become more resilient. And at the same time, we must, and we have not done very much in consumption and production, called the circular economy. But all of these and the numbers next to them are the Sustainable Development Goals, all fit within this framework. And the point of looking at it this way is many people are looking with one lens, for example, of the energy transition, but not what effect that will have on the human demographics or consumption and production. We have to look at them in harmony. And the transformations are synergistic between them. As I said, this is a complex system. Also, I like to point out to our government that attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, even if it is pushed out a little bit into the future, is necessary for global security and resilience of all human civilization, including the US and developed nations. We are seeing increased economic damage from climate shocks, even now, looking at the wildfires in Australia and in the Western US at the moment. Very intense hurricanes in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, desertification and sea level rise. And we are seeing now climate-induced migrations. Our oceans and land and air is polluted. And we need to reduce this. It has incredible effect on both the ecosystem and human health. Biodiversity loss will lose us important compounds for new medicines in the future, as well as food resiliency. And wouldn't it be nice if we had efficient use of resources instead of conflicts over resources? Inequality has been definitely brought to the forefront during COVID-19. We would have reduced unrest and conflicts due to inequality if we reduce it. Also reduced economic and conflict-induced migrations. If we had increased international cooperation in science, technology, and innovation for the global commons, instead of national competition in arms, we would be better off. And it certainly is the case that equitable treatment of women, including, very important, education of girls worldwide, will lead to fewer but healthier and happier people on Earth in 2100. And in fact, the World in 2050 project projects that just looking at the demographic transition of developed countries in 2100, if the developing world were to develop at that rate and be there, we would have 7 billion people on Earth, not 11 billion. This would be an amazing thing. Good, because those people would be healthier and happier and not fighting over land and resources. There are many obstacles for transformations, most of them having to do with the power of elites and those who are in power already, vested interests, a lack of planning, political cycles, CEO cycles are all very, very short compared to what we need for planning for resilience, which is decades. We have a regulatory capture by private interests and government stifling entrepreneurship. And very, very important and rather important for science academies, a lack of public awareness and understanding, a fear of change, a vulnerability to populism and resistance to new technologies in the global public. And all of these are need to be overcome in order to attain the sustainable development of human civilization on Earth. It also requires good governance, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but if we could reinforce multilateral cooperation, this would be a very good thing. However, tearing down international organizations in the middle of a pandemic and a climate crisis is not a good idea. We need to bolster them and have cooperation between nations and cooperation between people and scientists if the nations are not cooperating with each other. You will not be able to read this. This is an eye chart, but I just wanted to point out. In 2019, looking at all of the sustainable development goals and those within 5% of being able to meet the goal in 2030, those by between 5 and 10% of meeting the goal, those targets greater than 10%, but looking at least going in the right direction, and those that are going backwards, in fact, and going the wrong direction in 2019. So I'm just going to point out those that are I would like to be not in the right, or not going in the direction they are. First off, in goal number 1, which is no hunger, or removing people in extreme poverty, goal number 2 is no hunger. 600 million people in 2019 were living below 1.9 US dollars poverty level. And this is not good, but better than, whoops, let me go back. Oh, good. Better than the years before, let's just say. It's going in the right direction, reducing itself. However, malnutrition on the right, looking at 650 million people obese, is going in the wrong direction. And we still have 150 million children under the age of 5 who are stunted from hunger. This is not because we do not have enough food. It is because we are not equitably allocating the food to those who need it. We also are having rising inequality, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Increasing waste from human activities, and climate change unabated. So looking at global inequality, this plot is kind of difficult to understand, but it's in the Global Sustainable Development Report, and it shows some interesting points that what is plotted is the growth in say annual income, either wealth or capital, either labor or capital, versus income on the world on the horizontal axis. And the horizontal axis is highly nonlinear, as you can see. 1% is spread out considerably. The bottom 50% of the global population had about 12% of the total growth, which is a very good thing. This is extremely positive development, and the rise of developing low income countries in particular. However, the top 1% globally had 27% of the total growth in income. And those in between have been squeezed. That is to say, their growth has only been about 50% on since in these 4 decades, while those of the emerging countries and the lower 50% has grown by 100%. To look at, is this getting better or worse? In 1980, the top 1% had 28% of the total wealth. This is not the growth rate, but the actual wealth. And in 2017, they had 33% of the total wealth. So it's going in the wrong direction. Also, income across countries was converging from 2000 to 2010, but now the trend has reversed. If you look at global energy demand, the US Energy Agency projects in a very reasonable scenario that yes, indeed, renewables are going up dramatically with time, have been. There's still a very small part of the primary energy consumption of the world. And however, coal and petroleum and natural gas, coal and petroleum being the more worrisome because they are more polluting in terms of greenhouse gases, are projected to continue to rise. And this is mostly in the developing world. Coal will go up in India and China and parts of Africa, for example. This is not in the right direction. In fact, if you look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, first, the curve on the upper left is the total cumulative CO2 emissions in parts per million in the atmosphere. And you can see plotted from year 1000 is here, and year 2018 is there. You can see the Industrial Revolution started something rather dramatic, and that is the Anthropocene epoch. If you look at not the cumulative emissions, but just the emissions per year from 1990 to 2018, in the lower right-hand corner, you will see a trend which is not good. They are still going up despite the Paris Accord. In 2019, they were projected to rise even further. They need to decline rapidly to net zero around 2050 if we're going to reach the 1.5 degrees C goal. They are not going in the right direction. Also, in the middle of that curve is the 2008 financial crisis, which you can see a dip, but right after the financial crisis and the recovery, we got right back on track with pouring more CO2 into the atmosphere, which has warmed the globe by about 1 degree on average. If you look at the, let me see if I can move my, there. If you look at the circularity of our use of resources of the earth, this is a very complex Sankey diagram. From the left showing extracted resources of biomass, fossil fuels, ores, and minerals, what we do with them and where they end up going, solving societal needs, and then what do we do with them at end of use? You will see the alarming fact that we are recycling and reusing 8.6% of them. The rest is being ejected into landfills, the atmosphere, or the ocean. This must stop if we're going to make the 1.5 degree Paris goals. It is consider the circular economy. A number of companies and the World Economic Forum are focused on this. The European Union just pronounced that they would move to a circular economy. We are not doing this globally, however. Global biodiversity loss continues apace. It is extremely alarming what is happening to corals. We are down to about 60% lost by this time, not 60% of them. And we see some other curves of biodiversity loss of other species. This is an interesting plot in the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019 that shows various countries of the world and the social thresholds achieved, think of it as various targets of the SDGs in the human development, and the biophysical boundaries transgressed, so call it pollution, and or destruction of the environment. And you can see that there are two countries that I pointed out here, the US in the corner of pretty good human development and pretty abysmal environmental transgressions. And down here, the Philippines, not so great in social thresholds and human development, but not so polluting either. The country I was going to point out that is closest to where we need all to be by 2100 is Vietnam. And that is in this corner, 6 and 1 here. So what we need in order, so every country, of course, going through the path to the Agenda 2030, it needs to go through a completely different path. The countries who are developing in this corner do not need to put themselves on a polluting goal that the developed countries have already undergone. They can build a circular economy and use resources in a reasonable way, while these countries who are already developed need to completely transform their economy. Okay, so now 2020, what has COVID-19 done to meeting these targets? This is a plot, and this is in the United Nations Development Program publication listed here that was published in May, looking at a human development index since it was started in 1990 here in the left hand of the horizontal axis to 2020. It has been positive in every year except for 2020. Even through the global financial crisis, we have managed to keep a positive human development index, moving development forward until this year. And in fact, it may be 100 million people pushed into the poverty level on top of the 600 million already. This assumed that there would be a fast recovery in the second half of 2020, which I don't believe will happen. So it will actually push it more negative because it includes the education of children, which has been radically changed in the developing world in particular without access to internet. There is a silver lining, however, and that is you can see that the CO2 emissions is the largest ever during the lockdown. It is way larger than World War II, the oil shock in the 1980s, or the financial crisis. It in fact fell 8% and perhaps even more. What happened worldwide was people in Delhi, India, could actually have clear skies. Pollution was dramatically reduced. Question for the world is, can we take advantage of this crisis? The world oil prices at one point during the COVID-19 crisis went below zero. ExxonMobil the largest energy producer of the US, was taken off the S&T 500 because its market cap shrank so much. Oil is still being pumped out. However, we can do something about the energy transition, as pointed out by the International Energy Agency, to build back green. I will point out that the fiscal stimulus so far is greater than 8 trillion US dollars. And it shows you, this is the direct spending and the loans and guarantees by April of, depending on the Human Development Index, so the developing nations and the developed nations. And you can see that some nations are spending up to 20% of GDP on stimulus. If you look at estimated costs of the transitions for Agenda 2030, they are comparable to this fiscal stimulus spending. And in fact, speaking of the number of children who are removed from school during this crisis, the bridging the gap in internet access between the low and middle income countries and the high income countries is only $100 billion. The Global Sustainable Recovery Plan of the International Energy Agency, they claim to be $3 trillion. The EU's circular economy plan is about 120 billion per year. The UN development programs estimate at the infrastructure needed to end extreme poverty and educate all children is $5 to $7 trillion per year. If we need about 10 trillion per year, let's just say, this is 7% of the 2019 global GDP. We are already spending about that amount in fiscal stimulus. Why do not we use this wisely? I wanted to point out here that the crisis estimate for loss of global GDP is about 3 to 6%. So the academies have done a lot with responding to COVID-19. IAP has written a number of letters. Here's one, for example, open letter to the UN with many academies across the globe, including the pontifical academies, on health inequity, global green recovery, extremely important, and a number of other issues. Two other reports that we are working on, even during the pandemic, is climate change and health, and also how to build and design resilient cities, which are also healthy and happy. In the UN Economic and Social Council high-level political forum, the delegates there basically had the same point, which is we must not stop working on the 2030 agenda. In fact, this is the very time that governments are spending to build back their economies. Let's build them resilient and sustainable. And if you look at the Earth from space, you can see just how fragile our small planet is. with that, I thank you. And you can look up the inter-academies and what they're doing at that website. And I hope to answer questions now and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for that lecture, Professor Cherry. Yeah, before we move on to the Q&A, so I'd like to call Dr. Joel Coelho to say a few words.
All right. Cherry, thank you so much for your talk, which I found very panoramic and, of course, quite enlightening. And thank you again for agreeing to speak with the Philippine American Academy of Science and Engineering. The first question I have is, I'm aware that the development model that most countries are adapting today, particularly the emerging economies, are the same development models that the European countries adopted back in the 1700s, the United States adopted, and the same thing with China, in the past 2 or 3 decades as well. And part of that is part of the consequence is the global problems that we have today. One instance is climate change. And so there is really a need, as you pointed out, that the emerging economies today need to adopt a different model, which is more based on circular economy, so that we don't exacerbate the kind of global problems that we have. And you pointed out Vietnam as a case in point. I'm already very fascinated about Vietnam. Now I'm more fascinated about it. So do you know, in a particular graph that you showed, they have high performance in terms of the social index or development, and they're less polluting as well. So are you aware of any practices or policies that are implementing that enable them to achieve that kind of performance that they're exhibiting?
That's a very good question. I know that I did not read their what's called a voluntary national review.
Right.
But I do know that they have major projects in protecting mangrove, which is extremely important for biodiversity, but also for climate change mitigation, because they sequester a lot of carbon. So they have set up much more sustainable fisheries and shrimp farming instead of cutting down mangroves, for example.
Yes.
But I do not know what their energy policies are. When I saw that plot, I also became very interested. When I was recently, last year, I was in Ho Chi Minh City, and they certainly had a lot of automobiles on the road.
All right.
So,
yeah.
So
okay. So I'm yes. I'm definitely going to dig a little bit more into that, because now I'm really fascinated about Vietnam. So if you don't, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the things that is, I would say, a silver lining for the developing countries is that a lot of cost reduction has gone into energy technologies that are not polluting. So, for example, solar panels, because of China's massive deployment, the costs have come way, way down.
That is correct.
And also, because of, I used to be in the telecommunications business, the developing countries do not have to put in landlines for telephones. They can go directly to mobile. And this is what they've done, and that's much, much cheaper and less polluting.
Correct. Yes.
So just keeping in mind that you don't have to follow the same path as the European economies is
right.
important.
Right. Yes. I think that's great to know. And if you don't mind, I have a second question to you. So as you mentioned, and this happens, periodically in history, that countries tend to become nationalistic and so on and so
Yep.
forth. But despite that, as you pointed out, it's very important for scientists to remain unified globally, despite what's happening politically. And I suppose that is, of course, one of the real benefits of the Inter-Academy Partnership, or IAP. So as you know, today, everything is politicized, even the World Health Organization. I was wondering if the IAP has any communication with the World Health Organization
Yes,
in,
we do.
in trying to kind of pacify that type of situation.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we also put out, the co-chairs put out a communique. Let's see, we can put out academy statements, but that requires ratification by 2/3 of academies. So they are not exactly with 144 academies. That does not, you can't put this out in a week. It
Right.
takes several months.
Yes.
Communiques are ratified by the 6 co-chairs. And one of our recent communiques basically said, look, you cannot defund the World Health Organization in times of crisis like this. It is just remarkable. I mean,
Yeah.
similarly, you cannot pull out of the Paris Accord, but
Right.
uh, the academies are, let's see, we have Iran is a member of the Inter-Academies Partnership. China, of course, is a member of the academies in China. North Korea is not. I don't know if they have an academy or not. Vietnam actually does not have an academy. That is a meritorious academy. Their academy is more like a national lab, I would say.
Mm.
But we have pretty much every country that has a meritorious academy as a member, and they are. We just recently put out a statement saying, just be careful, the rapid the rapid bringing before phase 3 trials of vaccines is a really bad idea. Russia, China, and the US are rushing to do this. And all the academies signed off.
Yeah.
Science must speak.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think Academician Rod and Giselle would like to say a few words. So maybe I'll go first with
Sure.
Academician
Sure.
Rod. Okay, and then
Yeah,
we'll have, yeah.
thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I agree with Joel that it was panoramic and very enlightening. And I'd like to mention that you really did a very good job in showing the very important transformative areas. And I just noticed that life underwater, which is number 14, well, because primarily 14 is so limited. It's life underwater, meaning covering everything in the water, in the marine, and all the water environment in the globe. But then I think it should be given more importance. Like for example, be considered in the consumption, production, in the smart cities, because
Absolutely.
many are coastal. Many cities are coastal, and even in the carbonization and energy patterns. So again, I thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I
Yeah.
have to go. I have another meeting. I would listen a bit, but
That's
I have to
okay.
go. Thank you very
Well,
much, Cherry. I will
very
be
nice to
citing.
meet you.
I'll be citing many of your statements.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you
Excellent.
very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Giselle?
Professor Cherry, thank you so much for that enlightening talk. I wanted to make a comment about mangroves because I just gave a talk the other day to celebrate the 80th birthday of one of our members in PAASE and NAST, who is with the NASA Goddard. And it is about mangroves and shipworms that are major agents to bring back energy from terrestrial to the marine environment. So I'm from the Marine Science Institute, like Redora, but my question to you today is not so much on energy per se, but on food and nutrition for our children and
Yes,
the way it can be used to also boost health and wellness and immunity to disease. So I would like to emphasize the need to look into constructive measures to deal with the economy and health, which are so greatly intertwined in this time of COVID-19. So in the
yes,
Philippines, you might know, Sherry, that an average farmer, coconut farmer, only earns 6,000 pesos or over $100 a month. And among us in PASE and our political allies, we aimed to increase that to about 15,000 or $300 a month. And I think that addressing the problem of agriculture and aquaculture for fishing communities, it's even less than that. Then you would hit so many birds with one stone, boost agriculture, agri-manufacturing, as well as provide the food, the much needed food and nutrition for our children, who, if we do not attend to, would really not addressing the problem of hunger and malnutrition of our children would have a very, very negative amplifying effect on human civilization.
I completely agree.
So,
I did not say, because I was trying to keep my talk reasonably short, and
yes,
as you know, it is kind of panoramic to talk about the entire globe, but food wastage across the globe is about 40%. 40% of food grown is wasted. It's wasted differently in the developing world and in the developed world. In the developing world, food cannot get to market. And therefore it's wasted before it can actually, it rots before it can get to market, because transportation is so difficult. And as you point out, farmers do not make a income that is sustainable, and that needs to change. In the developed world, people buy too much food and then throw it out. And this is a problem in obesity, because they don't buy nutritious food. If they're poor people in the developed world cannot afford nutritious food. They buy a very unnutritious staples and eat it and become obese. And this is a growing problem. So I agree with you. And that's one of the things that Biosphere 2 is focused on, is how to grow sustainable, nutritious food as the world warms and we're experiencing desertification across the world.
thank you, Sherry. I have some follow-up comments, but I hope to have a chance to engage in a conversation with you in the future.
Yeah.
But I think we would like to hear the comments and questions of our distinguished members of PASA and the NAST, National
Yeah.
Academy. Thank you.
So I'll have William first, and then I'll take two questions from the chat. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray. I'm really thankful that I've listened to your presentation today. Knowing your background from telecommunications and noting that in an earlier slide, you mentioned the role of digital.
Yes,
I wanted your opinion or your comment on perhaps highlighting the digital transformation and perhaps together with that, the smart cities as perhaps an enabler of the many things that we want to do in the
absolutely.
other transformations.
Yes, absolutely. It is essential. We let's see, the Sustainable Development Goals are putting a framework around these transitions that were already happening in the world. So, for example, digitalization, and that doesn't just mean everybody on the internet, but it also means artificial intelligence, robotics. I would include in that bioengineering and synthetic biology. And using big data and artificial intelligence to make decisions very quickly is going to be extremely important in developing nations, um, creating their path to sustainable development. Um, I'm going to say, I don't know what it is in sub-Saharan Africa, but over 50% of people on Earth own a cell phone. In sub-Saharan Africa, that is the place least of least cell phone ownership. It's still pretty large. People who don't have electricity have cell phones, and cell phones are used to buy things. It's completely transforming. Um, Cell phones are used for identity in India, for example. And it's transforming society in both good and possibly bad ways, if you are worried about privacy, but definitely in good ways, as it is bringing the ease of communication to people who don't even yet have electricity. Um,
Okay.
Critically important in smart cities as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could I just follow up just one small question? In our country, we are reviewing the role of the ICT industry, including telecommunications,
Uh-huh.
because we believe that a lot of things can be achieved and in all transformations that you mentioned, if we put in the hands of more and more people, not only the cell phones and the access to the internet thing, but using ICT in doing their work,
Yeah,
whatever it is, and enabling them to collaborate rather than to depend upon what people upstairs tell them. And that is a move, I think, that is really needed in most developing countries. How to empower the people through putting in their hands not only the ability to communicate, but the ability to co-create knowledge from their areas, and then whatever it is that will enable them to better their lives.
I
Thank you very
agree.
much.
Yes, I agree completely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to the questions that we have in the chat. So the first one comes from Vince Daria. So thank you for the talk. I agree that cross country collaboration should be encouraged to solve the problems you have mentioned. Collaboration is enabled when there is funding available. While there are some efforts from certain groups of countries that promote collaborative funding, are there efforts from the IAP to promote global research grant funding initiatives, for example, from the UN?
Let's see. I completely agree. Funding is critical. And I didn't point out that the development funding for countries that is going through the World Bank and developed countries has not kept up with the promises either. The IAP is a bunch of national academies and therefore has no funding of its own, or extremely little. As you know, talking to members of both academies. But we have talked to the global funders organizations, which are the national funders of the OECD, basically, about doing research funding. There's funding, for example, they fund future Earth research, for example, in the UN system. But we do studies, and like all academies are scraping by with a very little money ourselves.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question comes from Diana Aga. So, thank you for the great talk. For the US, how will the model for carbon emission be affected when California has its own policy regarding carbon emission? For instance, California plans to ban the sale of new gasoline powered passenger cars and trucks starting 2035, while our current administration is still pushing for coal.
Yes, I predict lawsuits, but California is a huge economy, and its regulations affect automobile makers, for example, sufficiently that it does affect the other states in the US.
Okay, so thank you for that. The next one comes from Julius of the OST. So the pandemic has inevitably made countries look at their self-sufficiency and self-reliance to produce what they need, especially with borders becoming less porous. This is very natural and predictable in emerging economies' survival strategies. Does this antagonize the global integration perspective or trajectory, or does this not offer yet another model to both survive in the short term and grow in the long term for economies and states?
Yeah, I don't think that it is, well, in the very short term, it might be negative, but in the long term, I think it is worthwhile for localities to be as sustaining as they need to be. And by that, I'm talking about food and medicines. The global Keynesian economics of you only do what the market allows does not work for local people who have to feed themselves and have their children educated. Cities in the future will need to grow more of their food, for example. You cannot rely on food being transported to cities the way we have been. What that means, for example, in Singapore, I'm well aware, is that you build 20-story buildings and put food farms inside. Those are a controlled environment food farms with LED lights. It's, I think, going to make people happier because they will be closer to nature, and they will know that they have the supplies that they need, and it will be more sustainable in the long run.
Right.
Thank you for that. The next question comes...
Cherry doesn't know it, but Cherry, that's part of my research.
Oh, really?
Vertical
Agricultural,
farming.
vertical farms, yes. So the next question comes from Lisa Verata. So thank you, Dr. Murray, for your presentation. Any thoughts on how countries could strike a balance between developing more sustainable agriculture to feed their citizens while maintaining the biodiversity of our forests and marine environment?
Yes, that's of course extremely important. It has been shown in fisheries that overfishing is a really bad economic means of fishermen staying, either getting food or fishermen staying in business. So you have to manage the fisheries so that the fish can have some time to uh, grow and um, enough fish can grow back so that you can then fish a few of them. Similarly, uh, farming needs to keep the uh, the first growth forests as large as possible and um, use sustainable farming methods that does not end up polluting the water table and soil downriver. And this is doable. It has been shown to be doable. It is not completely consistent with large scale agro business, but that is also damaging the earth, and we will need to rethink what agro business is. If it's small scale farming, it's completely consistent. When you get to very large scale agro business, it's we have to rethink that.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Chris Monterola. So thank you, Dr. Marie. It was indeed an enlightening talk. Can you comment more on the balance needed between financial intervention and organic?
Can I, excuse
Can
me?
you, I'm sorry, can you comment more on the balance between financial interventions and organic interventions?
Um, I'm,
Sorry.
Okay.
K.
Yes.
what,
Actually, there is a
what's
continuation with
happening?
that
Oh, okay.
question.
Sorry.
Ah,
Okay. Maybe you can just, yeah, maybe you can
aha.
just say it, Chris.
So essentially, the balance between financial intervention and the organic tendency of various facets of society to meet the SDGs. So when I say organic intervention, I was thinking about the natural
The
tendency of
natural ones. Yeah.
people. Uh,
Well, it needs, let's see. One of my slides had the obstacles to actually meeting the 2030 agenda, and much of that requires finance. Naturally, people want to be sustainable. I completely agree with you. And if we could have more pressure from the bottom of, let's just say, ordinary people saying they don't want to buy something if it's
Mm-hmm.
not farmed sustainably, that would be a major positive. And that's beginning to happen, actually. It's certainly happening among young people. However, the vested interests.
Scientist Luli Cruz. So, Professor Murray, thanks a lot for your great informative talk on the SDGs and resilience. I agree that even as we try to improve the Philippine Development Index, we should already work towards a circular economy. We are developing a Future Earth Philippines platform for sustainability. Okay.
Very good. Excellent.
So I
Good to
believe
hear.
that, yeah, National Scientist Lily Cruz is the one in charge for Future Earth Philippines initiatives here.
Super.
Okay, and then the last note comes from academician Rhoda Sansa. So congratulations, Paase. Thank you once again, Professor Murray. So I cannot help but comment on fisheries. So it's big time fishing by big companies compared to small time fishing should be further looked
Yes,
into.
yes, I agree. Just as for agro business, um, fishery business as well.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe I want to ask you about something. Can you comment on what do you call this like the rebound effects, so for example circular economy and trying to bring down maybe carbon intensities of energy. Do you have any thoughts on the rebound effects wherein
Yes,
consumption patterns
yes,
tend to increase because
that
they
is,
feel like yeah.
yep. There definitely is a rebound effect, and that is uh, a a problem of system dynamics. That is to say, if you lower the energy usage by your car, you might drive more.
More, yes.
Yes. Um, this is where the tendencies of the normal people to want to live sustainably needs to come in. That is to say, it should be just as it took a very, very long time in the world to say, um, let's say, smoking is bad for your health, when it was very clear. It took what, 20, 30 years. Um,
Before.
yes, people will look at other people smoking by them as if they're doing something wrong because secondary smoke is bad for you. Well, secondary carbon emissions is also bad, right? We need to have that in millennials and Gen Z certainly have that attitude. So that's a positive thing.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I think the social sciences will really play a big part,
Very,
um,
very big. Yep.
yeah, especially in managing consumption patterns. And okay, so I think that's all. I've exhausted all the questions, but before I close, maybe some words either from Doc Giselle, Joel, any
Yeah, so I just would like to thank you again, Cherry, for taking the time. And I think that this is a good, sort of initial introduction between you and also the IAP, as well as PAASE, as well as the National Academy of Science and Technology of the Philippines. I'm hoping that this is not just a one-time event, but that we will be continuing this dialogue with you going forward.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the dialogue and I wish you all a good day.
any other thoughts, Professor Murray? Any final words for our audience?
Well, I'm very pleased to hear the enthusiasm for sustainable development of the Philippines and the diaspora, because that could really help.
Yes. Right.
I'd like to thank
Yes,
you again,
Giselle.
Professor Cherry Murray, and
Welcome.
also Professor Joel Calio for making this possible for PAASE and for NAS. And we have a series of PAASE webinars. And actually, we do have a series of fireside chats, Sherry, in the coming weeks. And one of the topics would be on human capital development in the Philippines. That's
Okay.
next Thursday. And after that, it's on STEM education. And in that connection, I think that we should think positively of how we can utilize Filipinos making use of cell phones. One of the highest users in the world. Perhaps this is one way to reach out to our youth to continue the
Yeah,
education.
very, very good.
Education of our
Yes,
youth. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Giselle. So just before we close this session, I just want to plug our webinar for next week. So thank you very much again, Professor Murray, for giving us this lecture today. So next week, we will have an editors forum. So we have invited PAASE members who happen to be also journal editors. So next week, we will be joined by Anthony Chu, Wendell Rivera, Diana Aga, Chris Monterola, and Raymond Tan, which will be an editors forum. So I invite everyone who would want to know more about the details about scientific publication. So again, for the activities of PAASE, please check our website at paase.org, and our webinars will be uploaded at PAASE Webinars in YouTube. So thank you very much for that. So if there's nothing more, thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good day ahead. Good night for those of you in the
Bye.
US, and hope you
Yeah,
can join us again next week. Thank
it's getting
you.
dark here.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you. Thank you all.
Dr. Abiso, may I ask a question?